welcome to our Untold Climate Stories, Extractivism, Climate Colonialism and Community Alternatives. And what we wanted to do with this is invite people to join us on a virtual toxic tour to discover stories from around the world, from Indonesia, 2 places in Indonesia, from Kenya and the UK. And it's based on some work that we've been doing all together, but which has really given us an opportunity to start telling a bigger story about the making of climate colonialism, told from places where the experience of climate colonialism is very specific. And through this, to sort of understand a little more about the ways communities are resisting and finding alternatives. So the dominant narratives, obviously, in the COP26 have been very much dominated, coming from fossil fuel companies and the corporate sector, spinning various false solutions. And so it just reveals to us, I think, how important it is to disrupt the coloniality that is enduring in that way of telling about climate, and makes it all the more important for us to learn from these untold climate stories from various places and from the people that inhabit those places. We chose to think of this in terms of a toxic tour, as this is a sort of form of it's a form that's used very much by environmental justice movements to highlight people and places that are really heavily exposed to and resisting environmental damage. It's a tool of resistance, and it also helps disrupt some of that distance that there is between places, as well as we work our way from place to place. So part of the today's session is for us to explore possible and potential connections between these places and the ways in which they're situated and placed within this bigger story of extractivism. So we want to orientate you before we set off just by saying a little bit about how we're thinking about extractivism. And we see this very much as the sort of where climate crisis is coming from. So we're talking about extractivism, not just about extracting minerals from the ground, but the ways in which we, humanity and natures, are being extracted by a system that extracts without replenishing. We wanted to orientate our stories also through, you might hear some of the speakers talk about feminist political ecology as a form of environmental feminism that focuses our attention or orientates us on our journey around particular kinds of things. So particularly looking for those small stories, the everyday, the things that are often hidden in some of the bigger narratives and the bigger stories. But we think that bringing all of those together collectively gives us a sort of rounder picture, a better understanding of what's at stake, but more importantly, perhaps how we might move towards transforming and working towards system change rather than climate change. So I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm going to hand us over now to our 4 speakers, and as we take our journey, each of them will introduce themselves and the place that they're narrating from. And do think as we're listening, think about some of those connections as they emerge, because what we really want to do is learn from you, the audience, as well, about possible connections that are unexpected. So it would be really great to hear from you and hear perhaps some of the ways in which your stories from your places kind of interweave with the stories that we're telling here. So if we could have the next slide, please. So this, just before we get going, just this map is from the Decolonial Atlas, which is a fantastic online project, really, I suppose you'd say. And the map here, which we've chosen to sort of work around, this is a global map of watersheds. They've been unnamed, but I think it tells us something about the way in which we're trying to sort of figure through these stories. And water is a kind of enduring theme throughout all of them as the life source on the planet, and something that I think involves so much of what these stories go on to tell. So over to our first speaker, if we could have the next slide, please. So over to you, Deanne.
Thanks so much, Becky, and thanks everyone for having us here. Hello, everyone. I'm Diane. Just a little bit about me before I start. Next slide. I'm going to talk about oil palm context in West Kalimantan, Indonesia. And before that, I'm going to talk a little bit about me, a little bit, I promise. Next slide, please. My first slide. So I grew up in a small village in Java Island, the Purple Island, next to Bali. And behind my parents' house, there is a little river. The middle picture, the river just looks like that, and then rice fields. The small river is where my parents and other farmers uses to irrigate the rice fields. I remember that back then, during my childhood time, I often fished that small rivers, and we got fishes as big as our thumbs. But we were so happy back then, and we just cook it ourselves, just using the falling tree branches. And then I moved to Bogor for college. A more urban area. It's close to Jakarta, where Indonesian capital is. It is 14 hours by bus from my village. And then after my 5 years undergraduate degree, I got a job here, and then I stay here until now. Jakarta, the Indonesian capital, is like 1 to 4 hours drive from my house now, depends on traffic. And now, that's about me. I want to take you to Kalimantan, the big green island in the map, where oil palm communities of my research are, although oil palm is also found a lot in Sumatra and now in Papua. The closest city to fly to Kalimantan is called Pontianak. It's almost 2 hours of flight. And the next slide, please. So this is how an oil palm looks like from above. Indonesia is the largest producer of oil palm globally, and it came to Indonesia before 1900, and the first large-scale oil palm is in 1911 in Sumatra, and it's always been entangled in colonialism. It was gained during a
statue of a World War II Lance Corporal called Jerry Muldoon and his dog.
Alan, do you mind just muting yourself?
The inseparable pair of wartime heroes.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then
together forever in.
Thank you, Alan. And then it came the first time during the Dutch colonial era. And until now, the establishment of oil palm plantation has always been entangled in colonialism. The main idea is that natives could not use the land efficiently and that there will be no progress without outsiders' large-scale oil palm plantation. And today in Indonesia, the total area of oil palm is around 12 million hectares. If you imagine, it's like almost a half of UK size. And the deforestation from oil palm is often blamed as the cause of climate change. I'm not going to debate on that. What I want to present here is to add to the complexity to the narrative, to present different stories of what community face in their everyday life under the oil palm canopy. The next slide, please. So I've come with 3 stories today. The first one is the story of Ibu Wangi. She lives in a village in West Kalimantan. I remember that to reach the village from Pontianak, the airport that I told you about before, we took another small flight, or we took a 12 hours drive. And then after that, we drive again for 8 hours. And that include crossing a huge river with no bridge. So we count on the crossing boats to do that. I have a little picture on that. And then the remoteness is also another reason why the state often considers this kind of place as empty. When the oil palm companies came, Ibu Wangi's husband attended the meeting and negotiation with the government and the company representative and received the money, the small money company said, to compensate the trees that community has planted a long time before. She never seen the monies. Indigenous and local communities surrounded by oil palms suddenly have their forests and land of livelihood occupied by state and big companies. They live in enclave area. To imagine what enclave is, please have a look at the map. So the purple things is the enclave area, while the white one is the plantation area. So it's basically surrounded, that little settlement of enclave is surrounded all by plantation. Ibu Wangi is one of those who lives in enclave area, in enclave village. She is 39 years old, indigenous woman, and with 2 daughters. One is 7 years old and the other is 18. The large-scale change not only changed the forest, not only damaged the forest, but also the river and the pollution. Life of the people and other beings at present and future are extracted. This is a picture when Ibu Wangi and her daughter went for a shower, washed their clothes, and fetched water from the river. You can see that the air pollution is a huge issue there. The next slide, please. So this is the daily life looks like for Ibu Wangi. For her livelihood, she managed to keep a small plot of rubber that she had from her parents. She worked in oil palm company as casual worker, doing the fertilizing work. She earns around 4.5 pounds sterling or $6 per day. That she left home at 6 a.m. and get home again by 2 or 3 p.m. And back then she showed us the painful scratch in her hand due to contact with fertilizer. After returning home, she sometimes attends to her paddy field when she needs to, and she does it all while she caring for her family. To do all this, she wakes up every day at 3 a.m. She aspires that her daughters, both of them, have a better life than her, and not as exhausted as she is just to get by every day. And the next slide, please. So the next is story of Ibu Ratna. She is on her mid-20s and she has a 5-year-old beautiful daughter. She lives in the same village with Ibu Wangi. Her husband, an indigenous person himself, came from a neighborhood village to work for the oil palm company. Now both of them are working for the company as harvesters. The husband says that his wife is an extraordinarily strong woman, as harvesting is very difficult and dangerous job, but she can do it. They said that they make a good money from harvesting as a couple, and that they manage to make saving each month. Their aspiration is that they will have their own plot of oil palm sometimes in the future, and then build a stall of small shop of groceries in their village. The next slide, please. Thank you. And the last one is the story of Bapak Pino. Bapak Pino is one of the indigenous lead in the village. He has a 6-year-old daughter, and he already started his oil palm plots close to his house in the hope to earn benefit. And he finds a lot of challenge though, as oil palm is not the same as rubber or paddy or his other conventional crops before. He hoped that he and other oil palm farmers are supported by the government. He never worked in oil palm company. He said that the work is too hard for him, and that since he is one of the respected, he manages to keep a good size of rubber plots for his family livelihood. He said that he wants his family and the community to get benefit from oil palm as well, not only in the companies. He knows that some oil palm farmers in other neighboring village manage to do so, and he aspires to do that. Next slide, please. So these three stories from Ibu Wangi, Ibu Ratna, and Bapak Pino shows us the complexity in the narrative of oil palm. With the huge giant scale of change surrounding the community's place, the community have little to no option to move on. But putting them always as victims are also problematic. It is taking their voice out of them and pretend that we are the outsiders who can answer their problem. With the leftover land, some community managed to keep their previous livelihood like rubber or paddy to keep them afloat. And some choose to add oil palm to their portfolio, or some choose to fully convert to oil palm. While large-scale commercial oil palm is seen as mostly destructive, smallholders oil palm by family farms is often seen in policy and literature as more equitable than the large-scale investment. And now in Indonesia, smallholders oil palm by family farms is like around 40% out of 12 million hectares. Thank you. The next slide, please. So this is the last part of my story. This is my reflection of my attempt to thinking through intersectionality, part of feminist political ecology. I'm thinking this in two levels. First, as in a big level, bigger as in space, geographically. Intersection applies in the customer-producer relation, global North and global South identities. And the second one is intersection as in community level. As we know, as I learned from my previous three stories and other stories that I didn't manage to tell today, community are not homogeneous. Oil palm community are coming from different gender, different age, different class, different ethnicity, migrant, local, indigenous, transmigrant. Sorry, it's my son. A study shows that oil palm farmers can be a woman, can be a man, can be having less than 1 hectare plot to hundreds of hectares, old and younger. They are those who build oil palm close to their home, and those are who act as investor and plant oil palm somewhere in the place they never visit. So like little oil palm company themselves. So please have a look at my table. The first is my reflections on times when I lived in Brighton for a year in 2019 until last year. Sorry, it's now my daughter. Sorry, just a second. Sorry, it's my little daughter now. The second part of my table is the reflection from my field work that I did with Research Institute, C4, in 2017 to 2018. I spent about 8 months in the field during two years times. The narrative of care in oil palm in the global north, sorry, just a second. Sorry, it's so okay. I hope narrative of care in oil palm in the global north often put aside the challenges in everyday care realities faced by the community in the ground. So I hope you managed to read my table. So when I was in Brighton, I read that when I did my groceries, there is labels like this product contains no oil palm. It's automatically means that product is good. And then when I read BBC and Guardian, among others, mainstream media, and then stories about oil palm is mostly destruction. But then I remember that during back then, the people, the smallholder, the family farm also says that when oil palm fruit prices drop due to the boycott, it's hard to keep up with installment of my motorbike and my children's school fees. Also now that the oil palm changes water, paddy field and forest, people need cash to buy water, clean water, and food. So now I come to my very last slide, please. So what I've learned so far with my polyfeminist political ecology learning is careful thinking that nothing using reflectivity and everyday life and reading and listening. Unfortunately, there is no straightforward or easy explanation on, especially in my research, what I know now in oil palm issue. So what I've attempted is to make connection with people in the front lines, the farmers, the indigenous people, the families and NGOs working on oil palm community. Thanks so much and sorry for the noise background.
Thank you so much, Deanne. So I'd like us to move on to the next place in the journey. So if we can have the next slide, and we're introducing Eunice. Eunice, if you'd like to come in.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Eunice, and today I invite you to join me in my journey doing research in the Mara region in Kenya for the last 3 years. I was born in Kenya, a town bordering the Mara region. I went to school and later worked in the region before coming to Europe to study. Next slide, please. Yeah, often we hear of the beautiful and glorious sides of ecological interventions, stories of wildlife conservation captured in award-winning films and documentaries told in David Attenborough's convincing voice. With the climate crisis, we hear stories of clean energy from geothermal energy production and from windmill farms emerging from all corners of the world, including Kenya. What we never hear is stories of the local communities, the owners of the land where the interventions are taking place, and how they experience these wonderful and thrilling interventions. And these stories are stories of pastoralists who are a livestock keeping community that call these areas where these interventions happen home. So we have heard about the boycott of livestock products because all livestock products have been lumped up into one unsustainable basket. But also research indicates that there is the intensive livestock production and there is the extensive livestock production that is usually done by the pastoralist that is said to be sustainable. So the next slide, please. So today I tell one of those untold stories, a story of Lily, a middle-aged Maasai woman who lives in Talek. So Talek is the white enclosed space in the map, and it is part of the Mara region in Kenya. So Lily lives in a small village, which is shown on the right side of the map. And she lives in a small hut with 23 similar huts. And she lives with 11 other people, including her 2 children and 5 others belonging to her sisters and her friends who live in more remote places that do not have infrastructure to actually go to school every day. They don't even have, the schools are far in between. That means they're not able to do a daily commute every day. So this story of living in many people in one small hut is not unique to Lily, but to all the other women who live in this village, because this village was started when the community members were displaced from the red parts of the map, and they were relocated into the white spaces in the map. Yeah, I think there are 3 main spaces in the map. So next slide, please. So Lily was not actually born in Talek. She was born and grew up in Koyaki, which is one of the ranches in the middle map, the yellow map. It is one of the yellow parts. So she grew up there, and she remembers her earlier years keeping livestock and living together as a community. She also remembers migrating in groups of several families during droughts in search of pastures and water for their livestock. And they would move freely anywhere in the yellow parts of the map. So in the late 1990s, Lily remembers her husband informing her and her co-wives that they need to move away from the place that they had called home for all their lives. He said that the land had been leased off for wildlife conservation. Although she relies on resources from the land, like water, fuel wood, and also pastures, and to get materials to construct the houses, because it is the women's role to construct the houses, she was not involved in that decision to actually lease the land. And that decision actually was not also really, it was not out of choice. You had to do it because you have land in that place. Yeah, so the reason for leasing out the land was because there was a spillover of wildlife from the red part of the middle map. So that is the Masai Mara National Reserve, which is quite renowned for its concentration of wildlife. And there was a spillover. And so annexing of pastoralist land is not a new phenomena in the country, and can be traced to the colonial era, where the community lost over 70% of their land to the European settlers who attempted to separate the interaction of wildlife and local communities, despite the two having existed for centuries before. With the new leasehold, men like Lily's husband, who are the legal owners of the land because of the traditional and cultural systems, they receive a monthly payment of approximately $150 per month. And this is for a parcel of 100 acres of land. Just for perspective, $150 is the average cost a single tourist pays for a night in the luxury campsites that are established in these conservation areas. These payments are also inconsistent and vary greatly depending on the tourism sector, seasons, and other factors affecting tourism, like the ongoing pandemic. The next slide, please. So over the years, the frequency and intensity of droughts and the floods have increased in the region. But with the land being used for conservation, it means that the community members cannot graze on it as they did in the past as a coping strategy. It also means that the social cohesion that existed in the past that Lily remembers experiencing no longer existed. Next slide, please. Yeah. So for Lily and many women in the area, that means she has less access to crucial resources like water, because the rivers that are actually passing through the Vara now, you cannot just go into the conservation area anymore. And water is quite central in actually fulfilling and performing their everyday household tasks. So during droughts, she and other women are forced to collect dirty water, as seen on the left side of the slide. And some of those who can actually afford can buy it from the water vendors in the kiosks on the third photo. And the irony is that less than a mile away, tourists like you and me, mostly from Western countries, are enjoying swimming in hundreds of liters of clean water in the tourist camp. So this scenario is replicated in accessing other resources from the region. There's a huge discrepancy between access of resources in the region between the local communities and the tourists, who are mainly the European or from Western countries. The next slide, please. So to cope with all these changes, women like Lily have been trying to get some income in the precarious and seasonal tourism sector. For instance, when tourists visit the sites and they want to be entertained, then Lily and her, her other friends can go there and entertain the tourists. Other times they actually entertain tourists in their village when tourists drop by to see to experience the local authentic life. And they also make beadwork, which they sell to the tourists either at the villages or at the gate of the reserves and the conservation areas. Yeah, and so many women refer to this as the life of waiting, because you just wait every day. You're waiting to see if somebody will come to the village for entertainment. you're waiting to see if you will be called to the campsite to entertain guests. So you're just having to wait almost every day. Yeah, and whereas these activities give them money, tourism sector is highly seasonal and precarious, and is also affected by extreme weather events, unlike the livestock keeping that they actually practiced for decades before. And the reason they actually practiced livestock keeping is because this region is actually ideal for that kind of livelihood. And next slide, please. Yeah, so during such times, Lily and women like her are left to the mercy of well-wishers who give them relief rations to actually continue living every day. Yeah, so and these you can see from the pictures. These are pictures taken from different times whenever there's a drought, whenever there's a tourist low season, whenever there's a government advisory sent out into European countries, don't go to Kenya, then within a few days, and this is what happens. During the pandemic, anything that actually affects traveling in the tourism sector, that means that they can only survive on relief food because there's not any other livelihood that they can actually perform because their traditional livelihood has been severely compromised. So behind the beautiful scenes of wildlife migrating and crossing over from the Serengeti into the Mara, behind the conservation stories that are gracing our screens, stories like Lily and how they are affected often remain untold, and that is why I decided to tell these stories. Yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Eunice, for your powerful story there. Please, if you have questions, put them in the chat. We will collect them at the end of the toxic tour. So we're now moving to our next place on the journey, and to Alice in the UK. Over to you, Alice.
Thanks, Becky, and thank you, Deanne and Eunice, for sharing your untold stories. So the stories I'm going to bring today are from my research around a new oil production site that's recently been approved. That's called Horse Hill, and it's in Surrey, which is in this geographical region called the Weald, which sort of stretches across southeast England. And as you can imagine, there's been a lot of opposition to this new oil production site, not only because of the industrialization of the countryside, but of course because of climate change. This is really our fossil fuel frontline here in the south of England, and there are many other proposed sites, which I'm glad so many of them have been rejected in recent months and years. However, this is the one that's still carrying on. So the thing that I really think connects the countryside and the climate, or the Weald and the world, as it were, is extractivism. As we talked about at the beginning of this presentation, this underlying set of practices and relations, strategies, and a system really of simplification, domination, accumulation, which results in social, ecological, and of course climate injustices. So even in Surrey, which is a very sort of privileged county in the south of England, where the effects of extractivism are really minimal compared to elsewhere in the world, we can still see how the system is really deeply rooted in policy and in culture. And this really does make it very challenging to resist. So I'm going to begin by introducing you to this part of the Weald, and also how it's entangled in colonialism and dispossession with quite a long history, in fact. I'll then give a quick overview of some of the main challenges that this has resulted in for the campaigners who've been working really hard over the last decade to resist this new oil project. So welcome, here we are on the River Mole. This is a tributary of the River Thames, so it flows south to north towards London. So this part of Surrey is in between London and Brighton. You've got the North Downs and the South Downs, which are sort of beautiful, sort of romanticized hilly areas. And then this is a sort of a flat bit in the middle. And it's underlined by Wealden clay. I've got some of that here. You can have a look at this lovely, lovely clay that's good for making things with. But historically, and we can look at the next slide actually, this clay has made it really difficult for sort of farming in the area. It's meant that this region has stayed forested for a really long time throughout like many occupations. So the Roman period and the Saxons, a lot of this still remained forested. The charcoal that came from the trees was really useful in the local iron industry. So the ground here is really rich in iron ore. And part of this industry was for military purposes. So here there is a really long history of sort of extractivism, empire, colonialism, and how that relates to the land that we're at. And then later on, sort of during the Victorian capitalist era, we see this sort of rise of brickworks on quite an industrial scale, bricks and tiles transforming British homes and lives, really. So on to the next slide. So part of the reason why these brickworks, for instance, were allowed to flourish was because of urbanisation that resulted from the enclosure of the commons, as well as new roads and new railways sort of connecting up the country. So just to say a little bit more about the enclosure of the commons. So here is the example of Hawley Common, and Hawley is the town where Horse Hill is situated. So it used to be this common, which meant that there were people who lived there, the commoners, who were given rights by the sort of lord of the manor to do certain things like collect wood, collect acorns to feed their pigs, do farming, do grazing, coppice for trees, to sort of have these more self-sufficient lifestyles than we're used to in England now. And then sort of around the early 1800s, so in 1816, this was enclosed, and that meant so rather than being a common land, it was then private property. Everything was divided up. And this made it much more easy for people to say, well, actually, it's not very good for farming, so we can just sell this land for building or for business. And so we see on this map on the left, you see this dotted area. That's actually the shape of Hawley, the town. So you can see how this urban area has just sort of replaced what was this common land, where people had a really different connection to the land to what we're used to today in this part of the world. And this pattern of dispossession is really closely related, I think, to the colonialism that was going on elsewhere in the world. So here we've got this connection again between the wheels and the world. What's going on here is somehow a reflection of what's going on elsewhere, except that, of course, here we see an accumulation of all the wealth that was being plundered from elsewhere in the world, as well as being accumulated from dispossessing people here from their lands. And a lot of this was sort of enabled by a moral imperative of progress, ideas of science and legal tools, making it really easy, in fact, for wealthy people to accumulate even more wealth, like ever more efficiently. So another aspect to think about here as well is who owns England, in fact. So during the sort of 1700s, 1800s, a lot of slave owners actually lived in Surrey, in this region of the world. And by the time that slavery was abolished, a lot of these slave owners were able to have their assets, so these real humans who were their property, compensated. So until 2015, British taxpayers were actually compensating these slave owners. We paid them £20 million, and a lot of that money went into land ownership. And that's why, well, one of the reasons why we have very little access to the countryside here in England. You can see the map on the right shows that we only have 8% of the country where we have the right to roam. 92% remains off limits. And that raises the question, how can we really connect with the land and care for the land if we can't even have access to it? And so, yeah, just to draw on that point again, that it's not only happening elsewhere, this sort of radical simplification, these plantation logics, ecocide, genocide, but to a lesser extent, it has also been replicated here in the UK. And of course, we have to remember as well that there's this whole other side of colonialism, which is climate change, and that's still ongoing. Our fossil fueled capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, which started in the UK, continues to dispossess people of their lands through the consequences of climate change. So on to the next slide. And here I really want to ask, with all that in mind, how do we stop unconventional oil production here? The little blue dot you can see is the site of Horse Hill Oil, sort of in between this industrializing countryside. You can see the massive footprint there of Gatwick Airport. And then you can also see the countryside that's not very accessible. It's not very like sort of present in the minds of people who are there. Remember, we've got those lovely hills to the north and south, which are more like nature, where people would go to visit. So I'll just whiz through some specific challenges that have arisen not only because of the geography, but also because of how pervasive the logics of extractivism are here in the UK. So on to the next slide. So I just wanted to include this video. I don't know if we can play it. And this sort of summarizes for me what Horse Hill oil really looks like. So it's a lovely field. This is next to the oil site. And then at some point, I don't know if the video is playing, we can just see an oil tanker rolling by. So a lot of the impacts of oil production here are really invisible. We can't really see the drilling that's going on under the ground. It's all these horizontal wells. The site itself is a very small footprint. And of course, we can't see the pollution that's in the air, not only locally, but also globally as well. There's a lot of displaced consequences of oil production. So as well as this invisibility, I want to think back again to this question of who cares for this countryside, who really feels like it's their backyard, because it's not a place that has a really strong sort of ancestral connection. We see like in other places really powerful campaigns, for instance, based on Indigenous lands rights or ancestral sovereignty. And that's just not something that we have here, because this landscape, for whatever reason, is not particularly valued. That's not to say it's not valuable. There's beautiful sort of bluebell woods and ancient oak trees, but it's hard to get that into the policy, and it's hard to get local people to care about that, basically. Okay, moving on. So just to give it a few more ideas of how extractivism is really ingrained in policy and how it's been made so hard for the campaigners to resist, which they have done relentlessly, I would say, over the last 10 years. One of the first things I want to talk about is whether or not it's fracking going on here. So in 2015, the government actually changed the definition of fracking, which means that anything that is sort of below a certain pressure or quantity of water, so hydraulic pressure, doesn't count as fracking, and therefore is not subject to the same sort of regulations as fracking. And fracking has been a really big issue in the UK. It was banned in 2019 while there was a moratorium, but that was a success. But what's going on here is slipped under the radar, and we don't really know what's going on because it's not regulated in the same way. They could, for instance, be using acid to dissolve the rocks. We just don't really know. And this sort of allows the industry to gaslight campaigners, as it were, to call us alarmists and to say, or even conspiracy theorists, with that idea that we don't really know what we're talking about. But of course, how can we when they're the ones with the knowledge of what's going on and we don't have access to that? So that makes it really difficult to campaign against. If you call it fracking, you'll get easily dismissed, but it may or may not have a lot of the same consequences, which can be really terrible for local people. So another thing that's going on there, and on the next slide, is the criminalization of protest. And this, again, is a legacy of fracking. So a lot of the fracking industry were confronted with amazing protests across the UK, but then they innovated this new legal mechanism of injunctions, and that basically makes it illegal, a criminal offence for people to protest or do watching and besetting, these other strange legal terms, outside the protest site. So of course that has a chilling effect on protest. People are scared to go down there and think, oh, well, maybe there are other ways to resist this. Maybe we can just do it the legal way and go through the planning regulations. But as I'll explain, that's not simple either. But the campaigners here did fight this injunction. A lot of time, energy, paperwork, money went into this, and they won. And on Saturday, during the Global Day of Climate Action, we did have a rally down there, and it was brilliant. It was so great to be back down there again. And a lot of people were talking about how this is a frontline in solidarity with other fossil fuel frontlines around the world. For instance, in Mozambique, there's a huge gas project displacing people, and that is in part funded by UK finance. So we really had that in mind, and also the privilege of being able to protest. It's something we often take for granted here in the UK. And compared to environmental defenders elsewhere, we're so privileged and in fact obliged to undertake protest. But that being said, it is threatened by the new crime bill, and which also seeks to criminalise trespass, so something to look out for. Another thing, and another slide, is greenwashing. So the company UK Oil and Gas have really been promoting this idea of sort of local oil as being more sustainable, but in fact it just goes to Fawley oil refinery, gets mixed in with everything else, and could be sent anywhere in the world. They're also saying it's part of net zero and transition, but it's just not the case. We all know, and there's increasing evidence that we need no new fossil fuels. They also claimed, which made everyone laugh, that of course Greta Thunberg's boat requires carbon in its building, which made everyone laugh. So yeah, very clear greenwashing going on. And finally, another challenge that's being faced is the fact that the planning regulations are really restricted. So when the councillors decide whether or not something can be built, they are only allowed to consider the impacts of the project, and that is literally the place where the project is happening. So they can't, for instance, include climate change, and they also are not, it's not within their remit to consider things like earthquake risks. That goes to another regulator. Even though this was a huge concern of local people, there were some earthquakes during the exploratory drilling phase. The council simply didn't have the power, or perhaps they just didn't have the will to put some restrictions in place or to follow this up further. So there really needs to be more power to local councils to be brave and to stand up to the fossil fuel industry, and not, as the planning regulations specify, to put a really heavy weighting on the economic benefit of oil production. So finally, I just want to say something about some words of hope and how the campaigners are carrying on despite these challenges. So next week, actually, they'll be in the High Courts challenging Surrey County Council because of their failure to include climate emissions when they approved this project. So keep an eye on that. We're wishing them the best of luck, and it just shows how much community support there is. Again, thousands and thousands of pounds were needed to carry out this case. They've got the support of Friends of the Earth as well. And it's not the only story of hope from Surrey, I would say. If we look back at our history, we also had a lot of slavery abolitionists in this county. A lot of suffragettes were hanging out there a lot of the time. We can also think of the diggers who continue to inspire land movements today. So they sort of occupied some wasteland and said it was a common treasury for all, and that we should all have the right to the land despite enclosure and private land ownership. So finally, just to end on a few questions, which I've lost. Yeah, so this is really about bringing it back to the idea of the land and how that connects to climate. It's not just a story about emissions. Climate change is also a story about system change, and that's maybe what we need to be talking about more, is how to change the system, how to think differently from extractivism. And what you can see here is we dug some of the clay from near Horse Hill and asked people to make things with it, sort of having in mind questions about how to imagine what else we might do with the land, actually, if we're not drilling through it. What could we do that's creative and that can build community? How can we build connection to the land, but at the same time rejecting these sort of nationalistic ideas that rely on like blood and soil and ideas of exclusivity? How can we create belonging, but not necessarily land-based identity? This also comes from ideas of becoming indigenous to place, which we hear indigenous people talking about. But how can we think about doing this here without sort of exoticizing or romanticizing indigenous people and ways of life? And can we cultivate alternatives from the land where we are? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice. That was wonderful. We're going to head back towards Indonesia now for our last stop on the toxic tour. So over to Siti Maimuna, as we know her, and her
Thanks,
story.
Thank you, Becky. Thanks, Eunice, Diane, and Alice for sharing the story. My name is Siti Maimuna. I'm at the moment actually at Edinburgh. Maybe go to Glasgow later. I'm Indonesian. At the moment, I'm studying feminist political ecology at University of Passau, German. So I will follow what Diane introduced about the islands. So I was born in Java, the populated area islands in Indonesia, and we'll talk about also Kalimantan. Diane talk about East Kalimantan, and me talk about East Kalimantan and Central Kalimantan. Even I'll talk about coal. Actually, my story will start with gold, because gold it's changed my life. Is not in the context of the material itself, but my father is the gold seller, street seller actually, but I'm doing my bachelor on soil agriculture. So I still remember what my lecture said about, and also the reading, how to create or compose 1 centimeter of soil. It needs 300 to 1,000 years to make 1 centimeter of soil. But then I don't feel that it's a relation between my study and my natural lover groups during my bachelor's, and then there is proposed mining in my hometown called Jember. There is gold mine in National Park, and since that I think about this. I think about gold, what my father worked, and also what gold means. And I just aware that forget 1 grams of gold, they're dumping 2.1 tons of waste. So it's make me join with the organization called Mining Advocacy Network. Please, next slide, please. So yeah, since Jatam is working, Mining Advocacy Network is the organization, is network who established in '96 by community affected by mining and NGOs who support them. So they support me and my works, and also my group's work and the communities when we against mining in national park in my hometowns. And it's bring me to join Jatam and start to work with the communities, support their resistance. But in the way my simply thinking at that time is like, we work for anti-mining, and in my mind it's like we talk about pro and anti-mining. It's just binary things like that. But when I'm studying feminist political ecology, it's really give me a different view. Although mining is like there is a colonial historics in Indonesia since colonial, how Kalimantan, this is Kalimantan Islands. Since colonial is like the islands who have extracted through the different commodities, oil, coal, and also logging. It's just changed time by time, depend on what global commodity demand change. So my research is in Central Kalimantan. It's a home of indigenous people called Dayak, Dayak is actually name given by the colonial to spirit between people from interior Borneo, they call Borneo, Kalimantan, and the coastal. So they identified Dayak people is backward, and coastal people is more clever and kind of that. So so this my research is in Murung Raya district, which is central Kalimantan is actually is separating from the South Kalimantan, because Dayak people asked for their own province in 1980s. When I come to, before I come to this area, I imagine there is just mining companies, one mining companies extracting these areas, but it's actually is not the case. Could you please, you can see the truck here. This is the mining, coal trucks, and also logging. They're transporting logging in the same road. Please. So this is my the way I was living in, I think around 6 to 7 months with the Dayak Murung community. When I arrived here, it's actually I think it's about 7 different of a logging company and 5 different mining companies. I learned from the Dayak community how they live actually is shaped or influenced by the river. The name of the village, the way they follow, the village. You can see here, they call Lanting. Next slide, please. So this is Lanting. Lanting is, for me, is kind of the reflections. There is the space that connects between land and river. This is the way how I understanding river in ethnic identity. How the Lanting is floating is kind of connecting between nature and humans. So every morning, people come to the Lanting, and they do everything daily life, most of daily life there. Take water, take a bathing, catch the fish, and even crossing. I was crossing the water. I was crossing the river to go to the rubber garden, or to the Swedens. It's changed time by times because of climate change. In the past, there is, well, floating is kind of the, what you call it, monthly life or seasoning life for Dayak people. But now it's more open. Of course, it's mixed between, logging extraction in the past, and then mining, gold mining. But Lanting is, for me, is not just the way how to understanding how Dayak people live, but also it's kind of resistance, because it's floating. Whatever the tide, the river tide, because of flood and kind of that. Lanting is kind of they're floating. They're following how the river, water river, kind of that. You can move to one place to another. Even I see that time by times it's always changed the way how go to the Lanting. For example, sometimes it's dry and then you just put the woods there, but sometimes they're floating. I cannot swimming, so I often falling in the water and kind of that. So it's really a big experience for me to live in the area. Next slide, please. So like I mentioned, that how people live is shaped by the relation with the nature. It's also the way how they live with the ladang. They planting rice, and by decision, which is there is reciprocal relation between people and nature. Could you next slide, please? For example, when they doing something, they call they need they have kind of ritual called sarodiri, which is reciprocal relation. When you do it something or you take something, you need to speak to the nature and doing ritual and kind of that. So they make kind of cake rice, and then make small ritual in each of the activities that they do. Even, for example, giving a name to the baby. You cannot bring your baby outside the home before you introduce him or her to the river. But of course, it's changed time by time, and not just because of mining, but in the past, there is also how the colonial introduce or push people to have different religions. They have local religion. Maybe it's not a religion. It's like a spiritual. It's like belief called kaharingan. But when Christians come, and it's changed the way how they relation with the nature, in the context not just the ritual, but also the sea, to understanding the cosmology, the way how they live. For example, the death ritual is the big thing for the communities. It's like the river is the way how is the way to go to the heavens. So it needs a big ritual and kind of that. But when you are become Christian, you don't need that. So religions, colonial, and also rubber is changed their life in the context of how the Sweden is also become shorter, and rubber is also make it easier when the global price of commodity is fall, and then it's make easier for coal mining, because people difficulties to selling the rubber, and then it's easier for the elites and the mining companies, the government take over the land. Could you please the next step? So you can see here how my story about the colonials, and then change, you know, the commodity time by time. Starts by rubber, but rubber is more like people can do it by themselves as a household and kind of that. But when Indonesia become independence, and you know, they adopt the colonial regulation, when claim all the land is state land, and then they give the government give different concession, like you know, logging, and next is mining. It's become the time is then shorter, and then shrinking the space of the people. But you can see here how the people is actually still maintaining the relation with the nature, and help each other is also part of their resistance. Could you please next slide? But I also bring the story about the East Kalimantan's, the way how the same story, how actually extractivism is really, it's not just the big size of the the landscape it changed, but the time also is become shorter for the people. You can see here how, for example, in 2004 there is a mining is get permit in one village called Makroman in East Kalimantan, and then 2006 they start to mine, and 2008 the first flood hit the village, and then now the village is surrounding by abandoned coal mine pits. In East Kalimantan, especially in the capital city of Kalimantan, most of area become coal concession. And even a mother like Ibu Rahma with the photograph of his sons who died in the abandoned coal pits. And now already 40 people, most of it is children, died in the coal mine pits. Just when I arrived in Edinburgh, I get SMS from the comrade in East Kalimantan that Feby, 25 years old man, died drowned in coal mine pit. So it's give me really open eye about when we talk about climate change, it's not just talk about emission, the CO2 molecule. We talk about how the people struggle, but also relation, not just in the context of coal, but also another, you know, how the capital systems is fueling by the fossil fuels. It's not just talk about fossil fuel itself, but also talk about infrastructure, even our lifestyle. And then it make me reflect about resistance here and resistance there, how it's connect each other. And together, I will continue. I will continue what Alice question is about. We need system change. We don't need climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mai, for sharing your story, and thank you everybody for contributing to the chat. We now have some time for sort of questions and reflections together. So there are lots of good points that have come up in the chat. Before we look at the more sort of thematic questions, there were a couple of quite specific questions that came in early on for Eunice and also for Deanne. If we could just answer those quickly, and then we can maybe move on to sort of build those links. But do be thinking about the connections between these stories and also between the and some of the very good points that I think have been raised in the chat that might prove to be a bit of a starting point for how we might draw connections between these stories. So Deanne, can I just start with you? There was a couple of questions that came in for you, which were quite specific about oil palm, which I'm just tracking through to. So the first question from Alison was a very specific one about oil palm from smallholders, and can we identify it in, I guess, in the value chains, in when we're as consumers, can you identify it? And also whether smaller plantations are also responsible for deforestation. And then Gus had a question also, which might be slightly linked, about RSPO and what's your opinion on it? Is it just greenwashing? So if you could deal with that first, and then we've a specific question for Eunice, and then we'll bring all of the presentations together for some more thematic questions.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Alison. And sorry, Becky, who's the second question from? It's Alex. No? You're on mute.
Langsung aja sih, waktunya dikit.
Okay. Okay. On the smallholders, can we differentiate it? Unfortunately, not for now, as far as I'm aware. And so I'm sorry that I complicate the story today about it. And then whether smallholder also deforest the forest, as far as I understand from my field work and from my reading, is that while many of the smallholders, what I'm talking is the smallholders, not the smallholders who is owning like 100 hectares of oil palm plots. They, to some extent, they do oil palm, and then they still have some of durian fruits or other fruits tree in their places. So I'm in the position to stand with the oil palm smallholders more than the large scale oil palm company, of course, in the term of whether they're deforesting or not. So my answer will be much biased on smallholders defense. And on RSPO, well, it's not perfect, but rather than nothing, it's a start, I think, for what I see now. And there are a lot of area of improvement. For example, in the indicator itself, indicators can be improved, and then also in the area of the auditor themselves, the way they do the audits, and the way of, like, for example, maybe I'll just share a little bit about my experience. I followed RSPO's audits a couple of years ago. There are some auditors who just do checklists and then not really visiting the community whether there is conflict or not. But then there is also others who is like really doing their work. So I think there are some layers of RSPOs that can be worked on. So it's better than nothing. It's a good to start with, I think. Thanks so much for the questions. Look forward to discuss more.
Thank you, Deanne. And then Eunice, there were a couple of, well, I say quick questions, they're probably quite complicated questions, but if we could deal with them quickly because we don't have much time for the broader picture. One was about what can we in different countries do to help the local people in Kenya? And then the second question was whether there's a parallel thing happening now to the conservation story about investment in renewables and wind farms in Kenya, creating the same kinds of patterns of dispossession. Are you aware of any concrete examples of that and what the message might be around that?
Yes, so the first question by Alison, yeah, so I think there's no one size fit all solution, and I think it's more about system change because this is a long ongoing trend that has been happening. You know, that's been happening, it's sort of taken as normal happening, but then I think one of the things we could think about is about, for example, telling stories about Lily and other lilies in the world, because I think these stories don't get out. And I know this because whenever I tell my partner this, and he just thinks like, hey, are you sure? Like, how comes you don't hear these stories? It sounds so unreal and so strange because that is not a story that is in the mainstream media. So the other thing would be most of these projects and even those tourists, those conservation owners are mostly from the Western countries, or these projects are funded from outside. So it's sort of this dynamic that comes outside. And maybe touching on to the point with Diane, the labeling of livestock as bad for the environment, you know, it just put them in a blanket. But then it's not livestock that is actually the problem, it's the production of livestock, and there are different ways of producing. And so with things like boycotts for things like meat, you find that we may boycott meat, but then for the pastoralists, that's the most feasible and the only actually livelihood that they can do in those areas. Those areas tend to be arid to semi-arid, so they're quite dry. So they can't just start doing farming, crop production suddenly. So then you find that we are like reproducing new vulnerabilities in these communities by doing the blanket boycotts. So the other thing would be, I don't know. So, and this touches to the question by Andrea and Adriana. So they're actually stories from the geothermal production in areas in Naivasha. And I think now they have actually found a new area to do more geothermal production. And fortunately or unfortunately, these areas tend to be areas occupied by the Maasai community or the pastoralist communities. And what we find that is that they take over the project. They find, yeah, we can get your geothermal from here, and they sort of displace the local communities in a way such that one member of the family of the household gets compensated, and the other members, everybody has to move, you know, because we are being compensated. And so, for example, there is the geothermal power, if you can find out on Google, but also there's a windmill farm in the northern of Kenya. It's one of the biggest windmill, I think, and it has displaced very many people, which has heightened conflict in the area because the local people now cannot graze because suddenly there are fences protecting the windmill, and they are now left with their cows. And incidentally, in these places, these people don't even have electricity. They don't use electricity. So it's like everything is channeled to the grid, and the rest is exported to the national grid. And the local people, they just lose and lose and lose. The compensation mechanisms are also, you know, quite, the head of the person who is registered as the landowner, who happens to be the man of the household, gets compensated. But what happens to the other people who actually use this land and these resources from this land? They just left out. So there are quite many stories. There are a lot of reports. Mostly there are reports that come to the media when conflict happens. And then they report, oh, these pastoralists did this. But then there's no backstory of how did it come to happen that the pastoralist went and, you know, invaded a conservation place or killed the owner of the conservation. It's always a story about these people just came and killed this person, or conflict started in this area. But it builds up from there, from dispossession of land, and these stories that boil and erupt to bring conflict. Yeah, so let me think if I have answered. Yeah, so maybe what could be done would be looking at the social impacts of the interventions, and especially of the rural communities, the local people. When, for example, if you're working in energy transition and you're going to a place, yeah, it looks good. It's a green. I think when you hear something is a green project, then you think everything is good. You don't think about it like it could actually have negative impacts, because it's good for the climate change, it's good for the environment. But then it's important to ask those hard questions, even for those projects, which are good. But then you have to ask, what about the local people? You know, how is their life going to be disrupted by this project? And how can this project, you know, help improve the lives of these people, you know, so that you can be able to coexist other than make the situation actually worse. And yeah, so that is, I think, my answer to that for now. Yeah.
Thank you, Eunice, so much, and Deanne also for your answers there. I know we're a little bit pressed for time here, but I think we've got a little bit more time to maybe broaden the discussion out. And there's been a lot of comments in the chat relating to this question around colonialism, as which I think we'd sort of imagined as this, as a kind of linking concept in some way. But so I'm going to do this in two ways. First of all, there's some specific questions that have come in for each of the speakers. If I could ask them to reply to those in the chat where they see those. But if we can use this remaining time maybe to focus on some of those bigger connections, and, you know, do jump out. There were two which I think came up in the chat. One is the question, the very vexed question around colonialism and avoiding appropriating it in ways that are unhelpful or can kind of erase. And then the second one is a question actually about housewifeization and Maria Mies and social reproduction, which I know is something that all of us have been thinking about recently. So I'm going to hand over to the speakers really to maybe think about the colonialism concept and whether they have anything they want to say in response to the debate, which hopefully you've been able to see in the chat, Alice, Mai, Deanne and Eunice. So Alice, should we start with you? Because I think it was raised, first of all, in relation to your presentation.
Sure, thanks, Becky. And thank you so much, Tony, I think it was, for raising this question. It's something I've been thinking about for a long time, like even like thinking about whether to do this presentation. I was always having these doubts. Am I drawing comparisons? Like, that's not what I want to be doing. I don't want to be drawing comparisons or equivalence or somehow saying that it's part of even the same story, because I don't think it is. I think they're very different stories on either side of colonialism. So I think what I was to do, I'm sorry if it didn't come across this way, was to sort of understand how these stories are part of the same system. Like if what we're saying is that we want system change and not climate change, what is the system? And colonialism is a part of that. But what we've actually together been thinking about is we've done less discussions on colonialism, I think, than we have on extractivism, and extractivism as sort of a more encompassing concept. So that includes sort of ways of seeing the world, practices within the world, extracting from nature, from people, and how that has a really uneven geography. So that's sort of how we've been thinking about it. But thank you so much for this question, and I'll definitely continue to think about how to articulate that better. Yeah, and in the same way that, like, we hear a lot about, like, oh, climate change is caused by humans. I think it's that same sort of idea of, like, well, not all of us are responsible for climate change or some of these, like, historical events. Like, we've been on different, not even us, our ancestors or our histories have been on different side of those. But how do we actually, like, begin to find a new solidarity, as it were, to identify the sort of corporations and governments who are not acting in our shared interest, and how do we hold those accountable whilst beginning to imagine new alternatives? So thank you for that question.
Can I, Becky?
Yes, please go ahead, Maya. I was just going to ask you to jump in.
Well, talk about colonialism, I think, is like entangled context, and I think it's like still in all the journey of the people, wherever they are in the south and the north. I think we need to put the context of colonialism and decolonialism in the all relation that we have. I mean, in Indonesia, also even with the historical of colonialism, now we challenge the same narrative, the same pattern of colonialism. I already mentioned about how the government claims and how the development with the economic growth is still one way, how the colonial logics still existing. But I think it's not just in the global south in a way. I think it's important also bring the perspective to the global north in the context of we aware about the relation. We aware about we challenging the same systems actually, with the, of course, different strategy and kind of that. And it's important to, for example, how it's give us reflection that we need to challenge the binary things, how to think relational, but how to think that hierarchy is not, is not just one dimensions, but there is a hierarchy. There is a different hierarchy that we're facing, either in the global south and the global north, which you still have binary thinking in the context of south and the north too. So that's I think it will give us space to think together when we talk about the system change. That's the most important things for me. The second is about the questions there is one of questions about, yes, the proposed, Indonesian government proposed to move the capital city from Jakarta to East Kalimantan. But in my understanding, it's just the difference, what you call it, a commodity. It is just different how they're financing something, and it's kind of different commodities. It's not really kind of because what happened is all the land, most of the land that we'll use for the capital city of Indonesia in East Kalimantan is owned by the mining company, and also oil palm company, who has relation with the governments, like the minister, especially the defense minister Prabowo, for example. So it's the way how the projects to, I think we need to aware about the next commodity is not just, it's like the physical commodity itself, but also the money, how they're financing something, sucking permit, paper, and kind of that, which is really struggling to understand. But I think it's important to put this kind of, I think it's similar when we talk about the CO2, something that we cannot touch it, but it's in the market. So I think it's important for us to aware that that's kind of a commodity which is crossing, colonial context and existing, and kind of that's important to think about our relational in the context of thinking about colonialism and critical thinking on the colonial. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we're about to get bumped off this call to make way ready for the next meeting. But I just want to say a huge thanks to our 4 speakers, and also to Desiree for the fantastic graphics there, and to everybody from COP26 Coalition for making this possible. I mean, what an amazing event this is. I mean, real solidarity to everybody. There's an announcement in the chat also about an event this afternoon for anyone who's in Glasgow. So do please, if you're able to, come and join Alison and Mai there. But just a huge thanks to such fantastic considered comments in the chat, and let's keep this conversation going. Let's really push on, because I really feel this momentum has built this last couple of weeks, and let's keep it going. Thanks everybody.
Thanks everyone.